Thanks everyone for being here tonight. I really appreciate that I get to follow Father Jim's talk. It's kind of an honor to follow him. He's such a good speaker and he's so wise. So just as Nahla pointed out, Father Jim spoke about, raising our children and raising children in the faith. And so I got the topic of caring for the older adult. And I use that term older adult because it could really mean anything. Older adult. Oh yeah, yeah, that's okay. Older adult could really mean anything. You could be an older adult at age 45 because of some serious medical conditions and you need a lot of help. But definitely you could be an older adult at age 100. And I'm very conscious of the fact that my mom is here tonight. So I know she's like, what is she gonna say? So we'll just do this. So just a little bit of background about myself, although I'm pretty sure everyone here knows me. I was, born and baptized in the Orthodox Christian faith, like that picture of baptism that Father Jim had, was one of those little babies. My parents raised us in this parish. It's our home parish. And now as an adult, I find that I think my main way of contributing to this community is by being a part of one of our religious education programs called Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. But kind of what I think brought me here to speak tonight, or why I was asked to give a talk tonight, is because, my day job is I'm a physician, and I work specifically in the field of hospice and palliative medicine. So a lot of the people, actually everyone that I care for, most likely has been diagnosed with a chronic or life-altering medical condition, or maybe more than one medical condition. And so they deal with, these are people who are going through suffering, maybe physical suffering, non-physical suffering, and a lot of them are going through the dying process, and a lot of people that I see, are very close to their own deaths. So as part of this, work, a lot of one of the main ways I interact with people is by going to their homes. We call it home care. And so I get to interact a lot with caregivers. And being a caregiver is a really big deal. If your life has changed because maybe you're caring for someone who has a lot of medical conditions, or because of old age or frailty or something has happened, and you find yourself in the role of a caregiver, it's a really big deal, and it's life-altering, I think. So a lot of what I'm going to present tonight is from my observations, what I've observed in the caregivers that take care of a lot of the patients that I see. So right now, I'm just wondering if anyone in the audience has some preliminary thoughts or experiences they'd like to share of caring for an older adult or being a caregiver already. Has anyone gone through something that they would like to offer up before I go further? No? All right, that's fair. All right, we'll just keep going. So as a little bit of background, kind of one word I'd like to look at is the concept of change. So for all of us, when you're born or if you have a child, you look at change as a positive thing. So an infant or a child goes from scooching to crawling to walking. What does everyone respond with? Wow, yay, oh my God, good job. They take videos, it's like so exciting. It's such a positive change. And these are changes that are considered desirable. But what if you're going through changes because of a serious medical condition or because of advanced age? What kind of changes are those? What do you guys see or what do you notice? Difficulty walking. So things that we kind of maybe do every day or multiple times a day become challenging. What else? You're slower. Yeah. Difficulty making decisions. Yeah, so mental processing, cognitive, memory, cognition, those features can change. Yeah. You need assistance. Yep, and there's a term for that, activities of daily living. or personal care, things like hygiene, toileting, transferring. Maybe you need a wheelchair to get around. How do you get into that wheelchair? Yes?
It also affects their mental health. They feel depressed, they feel lonely, they feel like they're a burden on their family members, so that's something they go through too.
Exactly. So these changes are not always considered in positive light the same way they are for a newborn. And then these changes can affect the way that person interacts with their community. So maybe you're no longer able to leave the house to perform your career or your job or some task that you have. Maybe then you find, it's hard for me to get to the services on Sunday because I have to get in a car, and getting in a car is really hard. So these are changes that can have a big impact on one's life. So what's the biggest thing that all of this results in for our older population? Kind of striking a balance. So then you're trying to maintain your independence. You're trying to function as if you could still walk, as if you could still get out of the house. But then your safety is an issue. So what if you fall? What if you no longer drive and you don't have someone else to drive you? So I just say this just to kind of paint the picture of what an older adult is going through. So along with all of that, a lot of the experiences of the older adult is the experience of isolation. And I've never really had someone say to me, I feel isolated, but it's something I observe. So when people start to talk about hey, I can't drive anymore, I can't get out of the house, then I start to think about, okay, so that means, maybe you can't go to those activities you used to go to. You can't get together with friends or family members the way you used to, I mean. And then top that all off with a few medical conditions, right? So doctor's offices, medications, side effects, ER visits. Your life really changes just because you're getting older. Any questions so far or any thoughts? All right. Oh yeah, Alice.
Something that goes along with isolation with today's society, a lot of people have their children living in other states, so they are all alone. They don't have their children nearby.
Yeah. So kind of a byproduct of the fact that as human beings, we no longer live in community is that the children that you raised and, they just naturally might leave to live somewhere else, and it might not be down the street. And so then, who do you turn to? That becomes another factor too. Thank you, Alice. Anyone else or anything else? All right. So kind of keep going with the theme of what changes do older adults encounter. You guys already named a lot of them. So there's the physical and cognitive changes that are easy to detect. You notice when, so-and-so used to get around with a walker, but now I only see them in the wheelchair. Cognitive changes. My dad used to manage his finances just fine, but I've been getting calls from the bank, and I'm really worried that he's no longer able to do it. Those might be easy to detect. But then those other changes might be a little bit less perceptible, that isolation factor, the spiritual factor, how do you stay connected with your faith community? And maybe if people are going through this, they start asking themselves, well, why am I going through this? Where is God as I'm going through this? Especially when people have a serious medical condition. And along the same lines, there can be a psychological impact too, a depressed mood, an anxious mood, those types of things that are not easy to fix. A patient a few years ago, he said, it's like your mind says one thing, but your body is doing its own thing. And you can't control the changes your body is going through. And I thought that was a good way of capturing the experience of the older adult. At the same time, I'd like to point out there's a really important concept that can come up here. It's the concept of grieving. So a lot of times we're accustomed to thinking of grieving as, someone has physically died and we're at their funeral and we're crying and we're really sad. But often, grief can happen just because someone is going through these tiny changes. They lose the ability to drive, or they can't live on their own anymore. And it's really important and really healthy to allow someone that you're caring for, to grieve the losses, to grieve that their life is changing. So my first kind of take-home point is a pitfall, that ignoring the bodily, mental, and spiritual and psychological changes of the older adult can make it even harder to go through these changes. Any questions or thoughts so far? All right. So as I keep going with this, I wanted to try to bring a little bit of a connection with what our faith teaches us. So we were just talking about change, and I think there are a lot of themes that we can find in our faith that help us address this concept of change. So for example, there's a concept of linear time. You go from Friday to Saturday to Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And our church is our faith teaches us that we're moving through that. But then there's also cyclical time. So the seasons, we go through, winter, spring, summer, and fall, and we go through liturgical seasons too in a cycle. I thought this was a helpful way to understand that our faith teaches us that change is kind of natural. There's, of course, the very prominent theme of life and death that, of course, we hear about in the life of Christ on earth, but then, every day when there's saints that are commemorated, what do we hear about? We hear about when they were born and then how they died, most of the time. Concepts of incarnation and resurrection, too, can bring home this concept of change. So incarnation, of course, we think of the incarnation of Christ, which we recently celebrated. But incarnation is something that happens on the small scale, too. So on a day-to-day basis, there can be examples of that. And then resurrection, that thing which was born can kind of change and be transformed. And then one other thing I'd like to mention about the concept of change is that in our faith, we are taught that weakness is strength because of Christ. So we have the example of the martyrs, which Father Jim also pointed out. And in our hymns to them, we honor that they were martyred not because of not for their own glory, and not by their own strength, but because of God and the gift that God gave them. And my favorite way of thinking about this is that our faith teaches us that orthodoxy is paradoxy, or one way that our faith has been described is through the expression orthodoxy is paradoxy. So I hope this is helping with just kind of trying to look at the concept of change that older adults go through. And just a brief verse to bring up is from the Gospel of Saint John, and this image comes from some of the material we use in our catechesis program, where it's said that Jesus Christ said, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. So I planted some wheat seeds at home, and one of the things that we do in our program is we kind of pull them out after they've been planted. That didn't work. One second. All right. I just want to get one more. All right, this might not be the best visualization of it. It might be really hard to see, but one of the concepts that this verse teaches us about the mystery of life and death, and I don't know how, we can pass this around when we're done, but so this wheat seed is right here in the middle. But in order for the wheat seed to give life to this, it's not really a stalk of wheat because I'm growing it in a plastic cup, but it's like, you can tell this would become a stalk of wheat. There are roots that emerge. So you might think that this seed, which was planted in the ground, is dead, but maybe it's been transformed, or it has transformed. Raphael, can you pass this around? Can you walk this around and show it to people? Thank you. Okay. So I just like to kind of paint this background to help us look at how our faith teaches us about change. All right. So then I think once we acknowledge and we help the older adult to go through these changes or to recognize that they're going through these changes, I think the question becomes, well, so what do we do? Or how do we help? Or how do we honor the changes that this person is going through? So a few weeks ago, I took my son to his 6-year-old well check visit. I was just waiting in the pediatrician's office, and I saw this Metro Parent magazine copy sitting there, and it said, "Helping Your Aging Parents." Now, the cover of this is like a 10-year-old with his grandmother, so I was kind of like, all right, what's going on here? But I grabbed it. I think it was okay, but I just took it, and it's just a very thick magazine. And what that kind of helped me understand is that, or kind of illustrated for me, that there are a lot of ways to help the older parent or to help the older adult. And it's kind of a matter of looking at one's own circumstances. So, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So the first thing we look at is once someone has reached that point in time where they can no longer, just like you guys described, they're no longer walking by themselves, can no longer drive, they're losing the ability to perform those activities of daily living independently. One of the biggest questions that comes up is, where is this person going to live? Now, most of the time, kind of consistent with our culture here in North America, people want to stay in their own home. Has anyone met someone who's like older adult going through changes and they don't want to leave their home? Anyone? Yep, Chris. Yeah, right? Some of you here might be, I'm not saying that rudely, it just might be kind of, what? We're candidates. You're candidates. Thank you, Jim, for saying that. You might find yourself going through this. So some benefits to staying in your own home, it's your own home. You know it, you own it, maybe it's already paid off, all of the above. But then there's the challenge of, well, if I can't cook that meal for myself, who's going to cook the meal for me? Or if I can no longer remember to turn off the stove, who's going to be here to help me remember to turn off the stove so my house doesn't burn down? So there are benefits and challenges that come with trying to stay in your own home. So some solutions that people implement are, number one, to have a live-in relative. So Alice mentioned, your child, that's an adult. That typically is someone who maybe could possibly live in your own home. Some people have like nieces and nephews if it's not their own direct children. And if they can't stay in their own home, they find themselves moving to the home of a relative that can take care of them. And the biggest thing here is that a lot of people need 24/7 support. So if you are the relative of someone and you need to take care of someone, you're taking care of someone, but you work out of the home for 8 to 10 hours a day, then the question becomes, who's going to be there when I'm not there? So there are options, hiring people as private duty caregivers. And there are lots of agencies out there that advertise that, we have people you can hire, you pay an hourly rate, and they might have different skill sets, but those would be people that could come to the home when you're not there. Any questions about this so far? No? All right. So as an example, I took care of someone. Her name was Jane. She was 97. She didn't look 97. Her spouse had already passed away. She was in an independent living community in the Dearborn area. She had 2 adult children who, again, were adults. They had their careers and their families. I don't think they even lived necessarily close by. Over the years, and this was before I met them, they had created a system where they had private duty caregivers that did 8-hour shifts. So there were about 2 or 3 different caregivers that would come into the home. So she was in her own home, in an independent living location, but with 24-hour supervision. And it wasn't 24-hour supervision from her own children, but from people that her children had hired to stay with her. So I mentioned the term independent living. So there's this, and that falls under the concept of senior living communities. So lots of places, there are so many in this area, you probably drive past 10 of them every day that fall into this category. And this is not a nursing home. These are senior living communities where there's they have an independent living side where people who qualify, probably based on age, can live kind of like in an apartments type style of setting, but it's catered towards that population. Assisted living, which is kind of a step below independent living in that the people living there probably need someone to come around a few times a day and give them their medications, or they need more help with bathing and toileting and stuff like that. And then there's memory care options where, let's say someone has advanced Alzheimer's dementia, and they're no longer, not only have they lost their memory, but they've lost all form of cognition. And so they receive essentially care with everything. They get help with feeding, dressing, bathing, toileting, transferring. These are typically what's included in a senior living community. I found a picture online and I just had to laugh. Externally, they might look very beautiful, but if you're looking at a senior living community, you do really need to understand what's going on inside. So there are lots of options for meeting the changing needs of the older adult. Finances can be a factor in determining what kind of care you're able to provide. But then you always want to look at what does this person want? Do they want to stay in their home or in a relative's home, or are they willing to move? And how can you make either of those happen? So there are lots of options out there. I know I said a lot. Any questions so far? Okay. So another person I was involved in her care, she's a 70-year-old female with liver cirrhosis. She had 3 adult children and 4 adult grandchildren. When I first met her, she was in her home. She was still ambulatory. Someone would come and actually help her with meals and laundry and cleaning up the house. But as her disease progressed, she was essentially bedbound. She had severe symptoms that needed medications to be given regularly. And the people involved in her family or her family members really couldn't do that. So she had to be moved to live somewhere else until the time that she passed away. All right. So really getting towards the end of my talk here, just to ask a question, has anyone had experiences with someone or an older adult who doesn't accept help from others or who's hesitant to accept help? Okay, over here. No. Yes, Jim, you have. Would you like to kind of elaborate on that a little?
As my older sister, she was a very independent, never married person, and never shared any information with anybody at any time.
Wow.
And as she was aging, she refused to accept help because she didn't trust anybody, even her relatives. And she fought it all the way. It was very difficult.
I can only imagine that would have been really difficult, especially when someone needs to take over her finances, someone needs to make decisions about her medical care, where she's going to live, all of that. So can you tell us a little bit about how you navigated that? Or if you feel like you navigated it? Or
Well, because of her stubbornness, if I use that term, and not accepting help from anybody nor listening to her doctors, she ended up falling and busting her hip, which then they did surgery that repaired the hip, but then her mental faculties started going haywire. And she was in a rehab. And the one night she started calling me, I think she called me 3 times, insisting that I had to get her out of there because she's watching them wheel the other residents out in their caskets. when I tried explaining to her that that was not the case, she got frustrated to the point that I didn't come there to get her out. She called the local police department.
Wow.
I then got a call much later that evening saying that she needed a guardian. And based on doctors who provided a mental evaluation, I was then appointed as her
legal guardian.
legal guardian.
Okay. So what I think,
She still resisted and fought.
right.
Did
So,
not understand or wish to accept that.
so I think that's a really good story. Thank you for sharing that. That illustrates that sometimes, or oftentimes, a lot of people who are going through the aging process and then also have serious medical conditions need to have someone appointed as their medical decision maker, whether it's by becoming legal guardian or being appointed as the medical power of attorney or power of attorney for finances. That is something that typically happens too, along with all of those other changes we were talking about. So just a couple things I'd like to illustrate when someone is resistant to accepting help. It might be helpful to connect them with something that's meaningful. So there's a type of psychotherapy established for people who have chronic or serious medical conditions called meaning-centered psychotherapy. And when I learned about this, I thought, I think this applies to all human beings everywhere, right? So no matter what you're going through, no matter what someone is going through, there's typically always a way to stay connected to something that's meaningful. So sometimes it's helpful to ask, what is meaningful to you during this time, and how can you stay connected to things that are meaningful? And again, for me, this just raises the point that as people are grieving, they're going through losses, maybe small losses like needing to be pushed around in a wheelchair, that it can be a really hard thing to process and accept, but staying connected to sources of meaning can help someone get through that. So the same person I mentioned in my first story, Jane, every time I saw her, she would say, I feel like there's nothing left for me. And, she just seemed really unhappy, even though she was fairly stable for where she was at in life. So I think the third time I met her, I talked with her and her daughter about connecting with sources of meaning. And so her daughter and other caregivers started taking her to music events and church-related events within the independent living community. And her children told me she seemed less unhappy after that. So I thought that was one good illustration. There's a couple other things out there. Father Jim mentioned the term dignity. So there's an official type of therapy called dignity therapy, which I won't get into here. But kind of asking ourselves, how can we help this person that's going through all these changes that they can't control? How can we help them maintain their dignity? So one of the ways to do that is to look at, what does this person want? What do they value? What are their goals? For some people, their goal is to simply just, be able to drink their coffee every day, and that's what they really want. For others, it might be staying in their own home, like we talked about. And so it's helpful along the way, no matter what you're kind of going through, to look at, how can I maintain this person's dignity? And another helpful way is to include that person in the decision making. So even if you find like, oh man, I got to get them out of the house, I got to take over the finances, I have to do everything for them. Well, what if they can at least tell you still what they want or what they don't want? That might be one way to help preserve dignity. And then life review is something where you can talk with someone about, what have you done in your life? What were your major accomplishments? What are you most proud of? And for a lot of people, it's just simply being able to tell their story that can help take the edge off of all the discomfort that they're going through. So as my last pearl for today, accepting help from others can be challenging, but connecting with sources of meaning can help others with the changes. All right, anything? I have just a couple more slides here. All right. So one thing I'd like to mention too is, speaking of kind of staying connected with things that are meaningful, would be helping, how do we help people stay connected with the faith? And specifically here, we're in an Orthodox Christian community. So there's, the first thing that comes up is, bringing that person to a service. And a lot of times, when someone is older and they're needing caregiving, they might not be willing to say, hey, I need a ride. So it might be about kind of prompting them or offering in a non-confrontational way. In the home, of course, staying connected through reading the day's epistle and gospel, reading from the lives of the saints, and staying connected with other people who are practicing the faith can be just as important for the older adult as it is for the younger adult or for a child. And one priest I met, he said, to stand in the liturgy is to be changed. And I think that as Orthodox Christians, we can remember that each person, no matter what they're going through, is a bearer of the light. We are in the season of the Feast of Theophany. Well, the light has come into the world, and each of us through our baptism has received that light. So no matter what, even if you're moving into a memory care unit, you are still a bearer of the light of Christ. All right, just have a couple bonus slides. These were things that I kind of touched on, but I didn't go into too deeply just because I wanted to keep my talk general and not too detailed. But one of the main things I do on a day-to-day basis with patients is I talk about advanced care planning. I wrote here, it's my favorite subject because it's really important. So advanced care planning refers to making medical decisions before you have to make them. And the two key aspects of what we call an advanced directive are designating what kinds of life-sustaining therapies you would want or not want if you needed them, and then designating your alternate decision makers. So if you can't speak for yourself and you're in the hospital and medical decisions have to be made, who do you want to make those decisions for you? So life-sustaining treatments are typically, first thing we think of is CPR. So everyone's seen that on TV or in the movies where your heart stops, someone starts doing chest compressions, maybe you get a defibrillator and all of that. Would you want to have a breathing tube and be connected to mechanical ventilation? And then those are the two main ones. Other ones that come up are starting dialysis or not, and then feeding tubes, yeah. So an advanced directive is it can be a legal document, but really the goal is just to have the person express what they would want or not want before they have to actually decide that. So the goal with advanced care planning is that it's a discussion, that you discuss these things with maybe your son or daughter or whoever it is that would make the decisions for you. Any questions on that? I have a picture here of my favorite advanced directives documents called 5 Wishes, and it's a packet, and you get to go through and designate those two things I talked about, but then also in this type of advanced directive, it asks you, how comfortable do you want to be, and how do you want people to treat you? And you can kind of circle or cross out things you want or don't want, and so it really looks at the person as a person, not just as an object and that's going to get medical treatment. So actually, this is my last pearl. Talk about things that you want or don't want medically before decisions have to be made. Even if you or the person you're caring for doesn't get a document filled out, doesn't have it notarized and all of that, at least have the discussion. That can be the biggest factor. And then my last slide, we already touched on this too, but oftentimes people will need a power of attorney for finances. Someone that once you're no longer able to manage your finances, that someone else can, someone you've already appointed can take over. And then for health insurance, a lot of people find themselves, when finances change, they're looking at government-run health insurance coverage. And I know I'm just kind of touching on that briefly, but these are things that might come up as you're caring for an older adult. All right, thank you, everyone.